And now we wait. There we go. Good.
Yeah, here we go. We are live and we are full effect. This is the moment I wait for every year. This is like Christmas for me. I can't wait for this 90 minutes where I can be with my brethren again. And my brethren and my frenemy.
We've already started.
We're 30 seconds in and it starts.
30 seconds in. Already.
At least you didn't call you the banished one, you know.
Well, the opposite of NATO is OTAN.
So I don't know. For those of you who follow Miles Marshall Lewis, I'm gonna call him out on Twitter. He was saying some words. I wanted to call in Harold Pride for some backup, but he's still not on Twitter. So I was like, I'm going to remain calm. So, but I want to introduce my brethren, and this is our 5th time together, I think. It's like, I can't believe the 5 years have really flown by, and we're trying to figure out names. Where's that name we had? It was like Grandmaster Duff and the Fantastic Four, or something like that.
I missed that one.
I mean, you know, I'm down with that one. I also just like, you know, I feel like us not having a name is just also...
The band with no name. The Roundtable with no name.
Very nice.
That's how we started.
I mean, we did start with Sign of the Times, right? So.
That's exactly my point. That's exactly my point, is that we started with Sign of the Times. We started with the band with no name. And so, like, I just like the fact that we don't have one.
Yeah. So... everyone should know each other if you've been coming to this a lot, but I'm going to say everybody's names super quick with the quickness. We always kick things off with the one and only, the man when I know he's talking, I'm going to run to try to hear him speak, and that is Zaheer Ali. He is incredible. We love him, and he's been clubhousing. For those of you who are into Clubhouse, you can follow Zaheer on Clubhouse because he's been doing that a lot. And his Clubhouse, whatever you call them, are the only ones I attend. The only one listen to Zaheer. All right. Next up is I call you the rainbow because you were on Jesus and Mero, and I love the rainbow that you got, Anil. So whenever I think of you, I kid you not, I always think of you and Jesus and the rainbow. And we're here for the Rainbow Children. So I am so thrilled that Anil Dash is with us yet again. Then our third person, we won't have to mention. We're going to move to the fourth person.
You came prepared, Angela. You were just... wow.
So for those of you who don't know, Miles Marshall Lewis is a brilliant music journalist. He's an author. He's working on a documentary, which I'm super excited to see. And so he is an incredible person. It's just that we banter with one another. It's all out of fun. It's all out of love. And last but definitely not least, Elliott, who represents Minneapolis, because Elliott is in Minneapolis, and he has been with us from the very beginning as well. And I love his picture of Prince, who's calming. So he's bringing me down, which is good. Not too much energy. And we have Elliott H. Powell. And then you have me, D'Angela Duff. So let's get this party started. If you've been to this rodeo before, you know where we're going to start. And yes, this is a silly question, but this is how we kind of like do the icebreaker. And then we can veer off and go different places. But we are going to start off with Zaheer, because we always do. I'm not going to mix it up. As my grandmother say, don't mix it up. So Zaheer, when it comes to the Rainbow Children, what is your most and least favorite off of the album?
So, I mean, there's like the intellectual answer to this, and then there's like the feeling answer to this, right? So I'm not going to count the Wedding Feast. I mean, you know, I'm not going to count the Wedding Feast as a song. I see it as an interlude.
Sure.
I think that my most favorite song So, my most favorite song is The Everlasting Now, just because it is super funky. It definitely translated well live. That is just an amazing penultimate song of the album. But the song that like makes me feel like I want to get up and just jump is Everywhere. Which I like. The least favorite song, that's a hard one. See, D'Angelo, you just stumped me. I don't. You're gonna have to come back to me. I want to hear what other people's least favorite. I mean, I'm stuck. Okay. I'm stuck.
Right. I can't believe Zaheer is stuck.
Yeah, I'm stuck. Because you know what? Here's the thing. The Rainbow Children is very much, and I seldom listen to, like, I go in and seldom pick a track. Like, it is an album that I play from beginning to end. It reminds me of Love Sexy in that way. And so it's hard to think of the Rainbow Children, as in parts. Like, it is the whole thing, and it's hard for me to divide it up, because there's such an evenness and cohesiveness to the whole thing. I mean, I think about when Prince said, like, books and Black Lives albums matter, and there was like this whole, like, the Rainbow Children is like this whole thing, and it's hard for me to distinguish and make that distinction. So that's why it's hard for me to answer that question.
So before we move to I think it's really important to just stress what you just said. I mean, the reason why I love the Rainbow Children so much is I do feel it is a complete and total artistic vision from beginning to end. And like you, Zaheer, I just don't pick out a song to listen to. When I listen to the Rainbow Children, I listen to the entire thing. It's almost like as if it was Love Sexy, with just the one track. Because I think it's definitely more compelling that way. So it is a little unfair, the question that I'm asking, but I just, I love when we kind of hear like where each other, is in terms of an album project. So that's the reason why we're continuing with this question. So Anil, what about you?
So, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said so far. I think it does flow together. It's always hard, especially later in the album, to think of the songs separately because they are so connected together. My heart, the answer on this is Everlasting Now, and it's just part of it is not just how good it is live. It feels live on the record, which I think is actually rare. There are so many good songs that you're like, it's good. I like it on the record, or I love it on the record. And you hear it live, and it's like this other level. And this is the one, and I think it's John Blackwell to credit for so much of this. It just feels like you're at a Prince show. And I mean, on that tour, I mean, this was one of my favorite tours. I mean, I guess it was one night alone technically, but like the tracks from this record live were some of my favorite of everything I ever saw Prince do live. And Everlasting Now was like an anchor of that. And it's wild because it has probably the worst lyric in any chorus of his I can ever recall. Right? Accurate knowledge of Christ and the Father. I mean, it's like like you're like, is this a Scrabble puzzle? Like, where did you get this sentence from? And yet, like, if you're still like you swing your ass, but even though this has got the most ungainly lyric ever, that song has got to be amazing. So I love that song. I mean, that is that thing. Like, I'll be walking down the street, humming to myself, like, accurate knowledge of Christ. And that's like, that's got to be a song. If you're like, humming that's got to be a song. So I took the sort of the weakest track thing literally. It's Wedding Feast. I don't think I got to explain. Like, it's not even that funny to be the funny track, right? Because there's lots of hip hop records that have funny skits on them, and they're pretty bad too. And it's like, oh, this is sort of that. I mean, I think the production of that is actually kind of cool. I think Millennial on this whole record is kind of underrated. We'll get into that, I'm sure. And so, like, they no disrespect to their vocals or Kip or anybody, but like, it's meant to be a lark, and it is. So that's there. And then there's also a couple of songs that would be up there with Everlasting Now for me if they were instrumentals. That's maybe a teaser for later.
Okay. Thank you for that. All right, Miles Marshall Lewis.
So for me, I would say I gotta go with Family Name. That's my favorite song. I think it's got meaty lyrics. I mean, the entire album is very arcane in terms of like the storyline and following it along and seeing where he's going. Like, who are the banished ones? Who's the wise one? Like, you know, what is the digital garden? Is that the internet? Like, you know, to parse it out takes a certain amount of, you know, not even focus, but just intention. You know, like you have to want to be there to figure it out. And I don't know, I threw that out there, but like Family Name to me feels like it's principled to him. You know, like it feels like he really has something that he needs to get off his chest about this situation of Africans, you know, being enslaved and coming to America and having our names switched around. And I know that this is one of the tracks, if not the primary track, that sort of sparked some kind of cries of anti-Semitism and stuff. You know, with his mention of what was it, like Rosenblum and Perlman and stuff like that. And I get that, but it's funky and it takes a stand for what it has to say. And I think that the ending even is sort of frightening to me with the Thomas Jefferson quote. Mm-hmm. You know, like where it's kind of pitched high, and you know, what does he say? Like, if there's a God, we're all gonna pay for this. You know, that's I don't know. There's just this tinge of like, wow, you know, like it kind of makes me chill a little bit, you know, which was probably his intent. So all of that, yeah, you know. In terms of the weakest track, I mean, sure, Wedding Feast. You know, I won't even joke around and say, oh, there's so much to choose from, you know. The album, you know. Like, there you go. I don't know. No, you know, I don't honestly, I don't return to Rainbow Children as much as his other records.
What?
And, you know, there's certain records I don't return to as often because I've played them absolutely to death. And then there's records that I don't feel that strongly that I need them in my life. And for various reasons that, you know, we'll address later. The Rainbow Children is kind of one of those records for me. But going back to it, I kind of enjoy it more than I remembered, you know. You know, so maybe it was just where I was in 2001, surrounded by such excellent records by Radiohead and Jay-Z and you know, who else came out? Like the White Stripes, you know, whoever else. I wasn't so into the White Stripes, but definitely I want to shout out The Strokes had a great, you know, debut record. Bjork's last great record, probably Vespertine, came out. Jay-Z, you know, did The Blueprint. That was excellent. Like, you know, Radiohead.
D'Angela about to cut your mic. She's like, he taking a Prince time talking about somebody else.
Yeah, it was just, you know, I really was like, yo, okay, so people are coming with it, you know, like this doesn't really, this doesn't really come with it to me. But whatever. It's actually, it stands up better than I remember. And so, in a nutshell, you know, the weakest song, the album on a whole is stronger than I remember. And I would choose Wedding Feast, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Miles. Someone asked in the chat if we could mute Miles, and the response was, I could. I wish I could. I would if I could, but I'm going to be.
I'm being so nice.
You're talking about other people. And
remember the community guidelines, y'all. We all gotta like create open and inclusive spaces for people with different points of view. And Miles.
And Miles.
Thank you.
I'm so censored right now. Believe me.
All right, Elliott. Talk.
So I'm going to say this. So I'm going to start by saying we do have a first where usually Miles's least favorite track is the track that I actually really enjoy. But that's not the case here. So I'm following in the tradition of Miles and Anil. Wedding Feast is just not my, it's just, it doesn't do anything for me. But I do agree, right, that it's you know, it's an interlude, so it doesn't really work. I will say the way that folks feel about Arms of Orion is actually how I think about Wedding Feast. Like, so many people hate Arms of Orion so much, and I like that's my Wedding Feast, right? Is like I listening to that, I'm like I just can't do this. But if we're not gonna, so I might be overstepping it. So if we're not gonna count Wedding Feast, I'm actually gonna go with the title track.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
As my least favorite.
Okay.
We have obviously the kind of Darth Vader voice. It just seems to kind of go all over the place. For me, it doesn't actually work as a song. I know it's introducing sets of concepts and all these things, right? I know it's supposed to start the storyline, but that's what I think part of what made it difficult for me to, I think, initially get into Rainbow Children is actually because of the opening track. So for me, the title track becomes, I think, one of the sort of weaker songs on it. Strongest song, I'm torn. Because as I've said a number of times as we get together, is like, give me the song where Prince is really pushing the boundaries on sexuality, and that's probably going to be my favorite song. We don't have that on the Rainbow Children. We get close with Mellow, right? And so I want to just like say maybe it's Mellow, but the problem for me around Mellow is the kind of song itself, the instrumental itself, is a bit too mellow for me, right? I do want to give a shout out to actually one of my former students. As some folks might know, some folks might not know, right? For a while now, I've been teaching a class on Prince, most of his 80s catalog. It's about Minneapolis. It's about gender sexuality. It's about a lot of different things. And early on, when I first started teaching the class, I used to have them compare and contrast a 90s or 2000s Prince album with an album in the 80s. And one of the students actually ended up comparing Rainbow Children and Dirty Mind, which I thought was really interesting. Oh, wow. And importantly, this student was actually thinking about the connections between Mellow and then actually sort of the title track in terms of Dirty Mind, and thinking about what it means to have a dirty mind, what it means to have and what it means to have a mellow mind, right? Mellow not simply as a kind of calm, a move from sex to sensuality, but also, and I thought he made a brilliant point here, mellow as a kind of maturation, right? So it actually is detailing a particular kind of growth and sort of understandings around sex, around eroticism, around relationships. And I was like, oh, that's really smart. And so like, I wanted to give a shout out to that student, because I think that's a really, really brilliant kind of thing, right? Because I think we tend to think about these kinds of eras as being sort of completely separate, right? We talk about him becoming a Jehovah's Witness and this kind of complete sort of disavowal of the previous 80s stuff, which is true, but also not true at the same time. And I think that was one of the things that sort of that student was actually trying to get me to think about. So I want to shout out that. But because I can't fully get down with Mellow, Last December is actually my favorite song. So actually, I think that is, for me, it's up there as a closer, actually. When I think about Prince albums and I think about the last song, Last December is really high on the list for me. It's definitely top 10. It does everything that I think you want to have when you go on this journey in the Rainbow Children. It uplifts, it makes me happier. It does something to me. It's just such a joyful and a joyous moment for me. Last December is just that. It's beautifully, I think, constructed in terms of the music, and it does something to me. And so I feel better when I listen to Last December. And so when I think about all the great closing songs that Prince has had, I really think that Last December should be really appreciated as being, again, for me, in the top 10. Has to be in the top 10.
Thanks, Elliott. So for me, and I know also for Harold Pride, because we are together as one, we love deconstruction. Deconstruction is my absolute favorite song off of Rainbow Children, and I wish that it was longer. However, I do have a proclivity towards Prince's shorter songs. I love Prince's short songs, but I really wish that there was like a 25-minute version of Deconstruction, because I just live there. And for me, I really love the sonic palette of the Rainbow Children. And before I talk about the sonic palette, because that's going to lead us to our next question, and one I think that Zaheer is going to relish, I do agree with everyone who's spoken so far that The Wedding Feast is my least favorite. And yet, you could not consider a song. It could be considered maybe an interlude, but I think it really breaks the seriousness. Well, not even the seriousness. It just sort of breaks the mood that the album has as a whole, because I see it as like one big track. But when that comes up, it's so jarring, and it's not in the same tone as the rest of the songs, that it really sort of breaks me out of it. And I really wish that it didn't exist at all on this album, if ever. So,
Agreed.
yeah, it's really, it's, I mean, it just really, I don't know. So Camilla's saying I'm breaking up. Am I breaking up? It might be.
We can hear you.
It's fine with me.
All right. So I was talking about sonic palette, and I think Zaheer and I had started a conversation about this. A lot of people say that Prince was responding to the neo-soul movement with this particular album. I personally don't think so, but we're going to have a conversation about that. Elliott seems like he's ready to rock, but we're yeah. Come with you. You're ready to talk. Let's talk about it.
No, sorry. I was going to say I know it's Miles's. That's Miles's take, right? So like I'm ready.
Actually, no, it's not. I've revised my my opinion about that.
See, Miles done tricked you. He done pulled a rope a dope. Don't read Miles' Twitter feed, because he's gonna flip the script on you.
Yeah, no, it's actually
flip
right. No, I think the most this record might have in common with any neo soul record is like Erykah Badu live or something, just in the sense of the jazziness of the arrangements and stuff like that. But I mean, in terms of what neo soul is concerned about, this sort of resurrection of certain soul elements and flipping them, with a hip hop like aesthetic, let's say, Rainbow Children doesn't do that. He does mention. He mentions Erykah on the live version, like One Night Alone, during that song where Common gets mentioned and Macy Gray gets mentioned. And I mean, that's a shout out to something real that happened, as I guess we probably all know that they were actually at some kind of backstage at some concert at some point. But, I mean, they owe something. They all owe something to Prince, obviously. Certainly D'Angelo does. But no, I don't. This is not really his neo soul record. I don't think that's what he was trying to do. That's what a lot of critics said at the time, maybe. But that's a little too, surface of a reading.
So one of the things is that, and I think D'Angelo and I talked about this a little bit, is it's hard to talk about Prince responding to, types of music that are in fact responding to him or have a shared legacy with him. I mean, the Ballad of Dorothy Parker is elemental to understanding neo soul, right? And so you have artists like D'Angelo and others who are listening to Prince and doing their interpretation of his style in some ways, and that is called neo soul. So Prince doing that is not Prince doing neo soul. That's Prince doing Prince. But I do think that the album is experienced in the context of neo soul. So when you go to the listener side of it, I was listening to the Rainbow Children alongside, Voodoo and Mama's Gun, and and Prince himself was listening to those records. I mean, in 2000, when Prince did in 2001. When Prince did the Prince celebration at Paisley Park, where he premiered the Rainbow Children in listening sessions, that celebration also had Alicia Keys Erykah Badu, Common, the year before Macy Gray. So he was very much attuned to this. So I know that sometimes
Alicia just covered "How Come You Don't Call Me Anymore."
Right. And so I think that a lot of times, we as Prince fans like to sit Prince on top of the mountain, and all rivers flow from Prince. But Prince was listening too, and so. I don't want to say it's his response to neo soul, but I would say it's Prince in conversation with the artists that were there, who were paying it, that he was paying attention to. And I mean, there are clear, kind of, nods to neo soul, not just, shouting out Macy and Common, but the rim shot, the Rhodes keyboard, that is something that when you listen to the previous Prince album is very different, right? Like Rave is just like this super electronic, driven album. And then the singles that were coming out of the NPG Music Club, which were from the, I guess, outtakes from the High album that never got released, were very much in conversation with Missy and Tim, right? Using that Triton keyboard, right? With all of those kinds of, staggered beats. And then he made this like a hard turn and then gave us this very warm, organic sound, which was very much, I think, in conversation with what other artists we were listening to at the time. And on his website, he was signaling those artists. He was promoting them. He was encouraging his audience to listen to them. It was almost like he was priming the audience for what he was going to come out with. So that's how I would handle the neo soul conversation.
Yeah, I there's a bunch of things that sort of tag in on that. And D'Angelo, you tell me if I'm getting off topic, because I think there's also the broader conversation of what this is in his career, right? Because there's so much going on with what he was doing online, what he's doing in concert, how many records and releases came out, that there was also a 2-year gap before this, which was at that point exceedingly unusual. So there's a lot there, but just talking about the sound here, interestingly, I think a lot of the 80s stuff is this filter of him listening, he was always listening, taking what was around him and then putting it through his sound, which at that time was Lindrum and Descents and just the Minneapolis sound and the sort of Prince sound. This felt to me almost like the inverse of that, which is that it was, I'm sure, novel to him in a way where he just hadn't done that trick, even though he could do it, when D'Angelo was bringing the Rhodes back out, when Maxwell's bringing that sort of the strings and bass and the sort of Marvin Gaye sound back out. And he's like, I grew up on this. I was raised on this. I know, you can't do, I know this, you know what I mean? You can't do that. And I think he sort of said, if these are the signifiers to my audience, that now a full generation has come that grew up on me and they want to hear those sounds, I give you those sounds, but through me. And I think it was sort of that same thing that he did, is it's always through the Prince filter. So it's never not going to be a Prince song. But if you're the signifier of contemporariness is this sound or this production style or whatever. And I do think, and it is it's reductive to be like Rimshot and Rhodes, but that is what a casual listener, what neo soul was signified by then, right? And I think the other thing that's sort of important to remember is this is, I really think to an approximation, his commercial nadir in terms of relevance in the pop audience, right? Because he had the years in the wilderness with the symbol. He'd had, Rave was perceived as a flop. I'm not talking about the music, people feel how they feel, but when you come and try to do the Santana and you go to the major record label and you go on TRL and it's not hits after hits after hits, that is perceived as a flop. And then you take time off. And then it's also the hardest, I have to imagine, the hardest several years of his life with his parents and his child and his marriage and all this kind of stuff. That's one of the things I think is I think there is no human in the world, even as strong and independent as he was, it's not going to look around and listen. And some of the most positive things he's hearing in that moment is this is when, you name it, D'Angelo, Questlove, Common, whoever, they go to Paisley Park. And I'm not even talking about the celebrations, which is another thing, but they go to Paisley Park. They make the pilgrimage. And you can't not, I don't care who you are, you can't not be affected by, wow, these people are at the top of their game. They're the new hotness right now. and they are coming to pay respects. I got to listen. Like, I think he had that respect for them, even as he always was messing with them, because Prince always would. And he's always like, I can do anything, and I'm going to make you wait 3 hours in the atrium while but like he's playing Prince games because that's what Prince does. But I think you can't ignore that. I think the other part is that this was a period of maximum experimentation on distribution, on technology, on communication with fans, like everything, the entire template for what is a common, digital experience for artists today, he set out in that period. And, one of the things I don't want to get too far off topic, but like, it's so central to my recollection of this record is, I live in New York City. This record came out in October 2001. And I think that is one of those things where like, he's filtering all of that. Like, I think he felt it was important that he give this record to people while the whole world is grieving, while people are shocked and unheard, and, that it is such a personal and sort of faith-based record. But I think that goes to the sound too. Like, I think there was an intimacy and a personalness. Like, Rave, again, fine record, but not, you couldn't say, oh, this is, I mean, you have, I Love You, But I Don't Trust You Anymore. Obviously, it's a deeply personal record, personal song, whatever. But a lot of that stuff was like, I had this in the vault and I brought it back out and whatever. Right. This one, like Family Name, I think, Miles, you articulate really well. Like, I think in both its strengths and weaknesses actually is like the anchor to the whole record. Like, I think it is everything that I would criticize and everything I would praise about the record is in that record. And that song, I think, just shows like he had never given full flight. Like the if he did the maximally commercial thing on the prior record, like I said, of going on TRL and being like, I'm going to get every guest star to show up. Family Name is the furthest thing from that. It's like, here's something musically challenging, and I have given full flight to every, both personal, deep, spiritual thing, everything he was as a black man, and also, frankly, some of the like conspiracy thinking he was prone to, and or theorizing, however you want to sort of say it. That's all in there. That's the 180 from like maximally commercial to maximally about his interior. I think the sound was the same thing. It's like he went back to the sounds he grew up on and to the thing he never gave himself permission to, which is like, I'm straight up making a jazz record right now, and you better come with me. I think that was profound.
Now, one thing I want us to talk about, and I think was really critical to the Rainbow Children, is the magnificent John Blackwell. Right. And whenever I think of the Rainbow Children, the first thing I think of is what a brilliant album. The second thing I think of, John Blackwell. It's because, the synergy between Prince and John Blackwell was insane. They were very much attuned, particularly on this project. So I kind of want us to talk a little bit about John Blackwell's impact, may he rest in peace, and also kind of transition to how that translates to the One Night Alone tour, because like I also see the Rainbow Children and One Night Alone as sort of one, even though they're separate and 1 year later and the whole 9 yards. But I kind of think of the Rainbow Children / One Night Alone as one thing. So anybody want to start talking about John Blackwell and his impact on this record and Prince in general?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I like Everywhere so much. My understanding of the origin of that song was that Prince heard John doing, like practicing or whatever, and playing the drums and built the song around it. And it's of all of the tracks on the album, I think it's the one that comes closest to like the very lively church music that, that's lift your spirits, and the way that the vocals are organized, and certainly the way the drumming is performed. So I think this was Prince moving away from a drum machine, but, letting a drummer really drive, not just percussion, but drive some of the compositions. And I think it was Anil who said before, like one of the reasons why the Everlasting Now is just bops is because of Blackwell. It's, and it's the reason why the album cut sounds live, right? There's a reason why there's like a bounce to this album, and it is largely because of John. And it's interesting. I mean, we've often hailed Prince for his drum programming, but this was something that, and I think that in the albums that followed, Prince was a lot more judicious in his use of drum machines. It was almost like with the Rainbow Children, he fell in love with live drums again, in a way that he had not in since maybe Michael Bland, right?
Yeah.
And so, but Michael Bland had a really heavy foot. And so his beats were very heavy, and John had like this speed that was like light. I mean, he could bang now, but he had this very light playing style that could bring this kind of frenetic speed. And for anyone who saw him on tour, he was like an octopus. You'd watch him and you'd wonder how our two hands there's more than two hands here. Like, I think I saw four at one point, right? And just even how his kit was set up, so that he had like cymbals behind him. I mean, he was playing instruments in front, the side, and behind him, and you could see that, right? Like, this was, and I think, this was the thing that was really fascinating to me. I mean, to just quickly switch to that tour, I mean, between John and Renato, these were two people who sounded like a whole band unto themselves. I mean, it was remarkable when you came out to see Prince in the One Night Alone show. Like, it was just like, there were not a lot of people on stage, but they were making a big sound. And it just reminds me of like the original, like we've sort of bookended this symposium with controversy. And it just reminds me of that small band that made a big sound. And the Rainbow Children, both the drumming that John brought, which sounded like a percussion, a whole rhythm section, and Renato's keyboard playing, who also sounded like, multiple hands on multiple instruments. I think that they really added so much to filling out the album. I mean, I know Renato didn't play on the album, but in terms of the live performance of it.
So another person that I think is really crucial and critical, and I have to give a shout out to Ricky Wyatt, who is my oldest Prince friend. We've been together in Princeton since high school, and he joins me on the Grown Folks Music Podcast, but we often get in debates on Prince's best bassist. And Ricky has mad love for Rhonda Smith, and Rhonda Smith is incredible. And so I think it would be great to transition to talk a little bit about, the One Night Alone tour specifically. So we want to talk about Rhonda Smith. Another thing I want to talk about is obviously Eric Leeds was on the tour, but Najee is on the album. And I'm sort of curious, how do you guys feel about that juxtaposition of Najee? Because, that comes up in the forums a lot, the conversation around Najee and what you guys felt about Eric Leeds. But let's start by talking about Rhonda Smith's role in the live show.
Well, I'll take Najee. So later, and I see Erica Thompson saying no Najee slander. Get ready for it.
Oh no!
I'll fight Miles with the Najee slander, although not musically. But I think Erica had a really cool article where she talked with Najee, and there's some things that I think help enrich my understanding of the Rainbow Children. So I'll pause until we get to that.
Right.
I think on the Rhonda tip, there was that EP, the live One Night Alone EP that had it was from Indianapolis, and it had like a couple tracks on it, and Rhonda was the centerpiece of that to me, from that tour. And how many times Prince had asked her, like, basically, like, kick that pedal and turn up the fuzz and play up front, and then her soloing on the Erica cover they would do and all that other stuff. Like, I think she was sort of very, very central and visible. One of the things I see, and this is true with Blackwell, this is true with Renato Neto in some ways, it was different than his prior bands. It was different than what he called the New Power Generation before, or whatever. Like, I think a lot of times my measure, I mean, he gave, whatever, Tommy Barbarella had solos and whatever, but I think there was a sense of, like, almost the measure before was how well were the band members playing Prince's parts from the studio was my measure. Like, and obviously they would improvise and solo and whatever on stage, but like that was the measure of what they were doing. And I think this band turned the corner into like their sounds were distinctive and recognizable. I mean, certainly, and I know I've seen people criticizing Renato too, but like it was clear when he was playing solo, that was him.
Yeah.
And Blackwell, you can hear it. There's no record where I'm like, who is that playing drums on this track? Like, you know who it is. And I think, Rhonda was in that place on bass that is, again, not true. I mean, I know Sonny was, Prince's hero growing up and childhood hero and whatever, and he's a great player and whatever. But there are songs where I'm like, oh, that could be Prince playing, that could be Sonny playing, from that era. Certainly, Brown Mark, incredible player. But most of that stuff at the time, part of it is I was young, but like I thought most of that stuff was Prince. Like I didn't know for sure who it was, whatever. On the songs, like I'm like, oh yeah, that's her. I know this is a couple years before, but I think of the one, on the New Power Soul album, and that's like, oh, this is like these are contributors. These are people that are playing. And we talk about horn players or whatever, but I think that live band, and this is not who's on the record, but like not just Eric Leeds, but Greg Boyer, and then obviously Maceo, right? Like that live band was a different thing for him. It was not, this is like my latest cast of characters or whatever. Like I think these are people that could go toe to toe and challenge in a lot of ways. So I think that's something that's pretty remarkable. The other thing that's really telling is you cannot talk about this record without talking about that tour, without talking about, like I said, the digital aspects of how he was distributing, because you had to want this record to listen to the Rainbow Children when it came out. You weren't going to like casually go to the Borders and pick it up on the shelf, right? Like you had to be all the way in and be like, what is he doing right now? To sort of get it. And then the other part I think you cannot, divorce from this is the celebrations.
Right.
What a change that was for Prince. Like that was such a shift. I think I think he was thinking because he talked many times about like I had the video in mind while I wrote the record, or I knew what the the staging would be like for this thing. I think he pictured, because he'd already had the first celebration when he's working on this record.
Right.
I think he pictured, I'm going to sit this record in front of people, and I'm going to sit with them in my castle in Paisley Park, and I'm going to play it with them, and I'm going to see what they think. I feel like that had to be part of the dialogue in his mind about how these songs are going to play out, because I don't think that happens, as casually. And somebody points out in the sound checks too. I mean, one of my, it's just again a tangent, but like literally one of the greatest memories I have of Prince is being at Avery Fisher Hall here at the sound check with him. Yeah. I felt it. I felt your presence.
12 hours of music.
Yeah, it was
sound check, show, and after
we're going to go there anyway, and I know a couple of us were there. This is one day, y'all, so you know what happened. We come in the afternoon, it's still daylight, and it's the sound check, and you're walking in, and Prince is sitting there in the seats with us in Lincoln Center.
It was so wild.
It was the wildest shit. And he played, and just the sound check set was extraordinary. Calhoun Square. It was unbelievable. Like songs you never thought you'd hear him do in your life, and one of the best versions ever that he did. Then it's the full One Night Alone show, and it's unbelievable. Just, I mean, for me, what was the song was Xenophobia as the opener. I mean, that's one of my favorite openers for any show. I would take that 10 times out of 10 over opening with almost any, even Let's Go Crazy. Like it was just such a ass kicker of a show to go into. And then I'm like, all right, we're 7 or 8 hours in. It's been pretty good so far, these shows. And then we go to the after show, and that's the one that half of it's on the One Night Alone set, and it's one show with George Clinton and Larry Graham and Questlove and whatever. And that version of Joy and Repetition is maybe the best solo of his ever committed to record. Like unbelievable, right? And we're 12 hours in, as you said. Like we're 12 hours in, and I'm like, okay, I'm time to go to bed. And he was doing that every night, and that series of shows. And I think that to me is what, when I see the cover behind you, Zaheer, of this record, I just think of that. Yeah. And and I think of that, and I think of like later on, I think the more casual fans heard, Kevin Smith talking about the celebration, the recording, the listenings. But I think that was all in Prince's mind as much as. And he's like, given that that's what I'm going to do with fans, and I'm going to be this intimate and this personal with them, what do I need to tell them? I need to tell them the stuff that I never let myself do on the pop records. I need to tell.
I think I definitely want to talk about the experience of the celebration because I was there, and I know that Prince did not get the response he thought he was going to get, and I think we can talk about that. But coming back to the after show, there is an after show in Rotterdam where Rhonda does this bass solo, I think in Dolphin, and it is just bananas. If you want to understand Rhonda's just amazing ability on bass, I think it's Dolphin. And no, I think it's Beautiful Strange. It's Beautiful Strange or Dolphin. I think it's Beautiful Strange, but I think it's Beautiful Strange. It's Beautiful Strange. It's just an amazing bass solo. And, just to talk about the ways that the after shows and really the way very much this tour was Prince embracing the jazz man role and the kind of democratic arrangement of the jazz performance where everyone gets a solo, is something that was very much in place here.
Elliott?
No, I was going to say, if I can say something really quickly about Prince playing the jazz man, because I didn't talk about this, but so I'm going to talk about Rainbow Children. I'm also going to talk about One Night Alone. But like one of the things that I think is also really fascinating to me, listening to Rainbow Children, is how Coltrane-esque it is, right? That there's, I'm not going to put it on the same level as A Love Supreme, but what I am going to say is that the relationship between Coltrane and Blackwell is similar to the relationship. So in terms of the relationship between Prince and Blackwell is similar to me between the relationship between really Coltrane and Elvin Jones, right? So like when I actually think about Rainbow Children, and I think about this search for a kind of higher kind of thing, right? I put it in conversation with Coltrane. So like I think about the relationship, especially about how Prince is thinking about sort of Jehovah's Witness, but also around African spiritualities, and thinking through what possible kinds of connections might actually exist out of that. That's the exact same thing that Coltrane is thinking of as he's considering multi kinds of sort of spiritualities and yet still being based within an AME church. But there's something happening there in terms of Rainbow Children that I think can put in conversation with Coltrane, which then takes me to the kind of live performances. And really sort of, Anil, you talked about this in Rainbow Children. A lot of things can work as instrumentals on the album. And I think in part, right, is that album gives a different sense of, in terms of, how do I put this? When I listen to sort of Rainbow Children, it feels live, and it makes me want to actually hear it live in a way that I think previous Prince albums, you're like, well, I can't wait to hear what Prince does with this in a different kind of way, right? Because he's using drum programming and everything else. When you listen to Rainbow Children, you actually, the kind of intimacy that you hear between you and the record, you actually want to experience that same kind of intimacy live. It's a brilliant approach to making that album, right? Is that he not only establishes a kind of intimacy between you as a listener and then the recording in terms if you're doing vinyl or CD, but then he tries and he's successful in establishing that same kind of intimacy with you within the audience. And it's brilliant, and I think it's completely planned out that way, right? And it's just I'm kind of losing my thought at the end of this, but I just wanted to kind of mention that the kind of intimacy, the kinds of feels that you have with that is just really, really overwhelming in a way that I think is powerful and uplifting. So I'll end there.
And doesn't the production hit that too? If you listen to Muse to the Pharaoh, it sounds like he's playing in front of you. Not that he made a record in the studio for you to listen to on the radio. And I feel like the mix and the production is for a different purpose, and it is.
Right, for sure. For sure.
Well, to say something brief about Najee, sorry, I wanted to put Najee like just in context because I'm not sure, different. We're all different ages, let's say. So I was a teenager in the '80s, right? Named after Miles Davis, so I was sort of a jazz snob already at like 14, 15, right? And this was a period that 1980s was sort of a period of smooth jazz. And so you had Najee, you had Kenny G, you had like Grover Washington Jr., you had this, populist sort of jazz that would be on the Quiet Storm radio stations that I really wasn't a fan of. I felt like, I remember my aunt, being crazy about like Kenny G, I remember seeing Miles Davis at Avery Fisher Hall twice, actually, before he passed. And one of the years that I went, it was like the JVC Jazz Festival, and it was Miles Davis and Kenny G. And they did 2 sets. And I think the first set, Kenny opened for Miles. How did it go? I think Kenny opened for Miles, and then the second set, Miles didn't want to break down his stuff. So he was like, I'll just go first and go home and go to sleep. And then Kenny will come after me, which made it seem like Miles was opening for Kenny, So that was the set I went to. I saw Miles. It was fantastic. And then me and like my uncle sort of sat around for Kenny and left after, 15 minutes or something. But people were like going crazy, and he was selling, 6 million records or something. He was big. So Najee was like part of this smooth jazz thing that I just wasn't really a fan of. It wasn't that he lacked chops or he couldn't play. It was more like, this is jazz for people who don't really know what jazz is, who don't, know enough to play Thelonious Monk or Miles Davis or John Coltrane or whatever. And again, that's my teenage snobbery that probably still exists. But that was sort of this, I felt like the Rainbow Children was one of the first records that really, like, my mother could listen to it, because it was so jazzy and it could be in the background, like in terms of what my mother listens to, I felt like this is the one that's sort of palatable for her, where she's not even going to listen to the whole storyline, the banishments and all of that. It's just something that can play in the background without him, screaming Darling Mickey style for her to go to the volume and turn it down, and so that was sort of one of the reasons why I wasn't really, feeling the album at first as well. Cause I was like, is this, I don't know, is this Prince light? Like I wasn't really sitting with it long enough to realize, well, no, like we'll never have Prince light. And that I think is kind of my feeling about Najee being on the record. I mean, when I, heard that he was sort of invited to be part of the tracks and stuff, I was like, well, what is Najee doing there? Like that just, because I had all these memories of what Najee represented to me.
Yeah, he symbolized a thing, and I think that was also a moment when people were sort of like, has Prince fallen off?
Right.
And so if you're worried about that, like I don't think any of us were, but I think, there was a sort of broader context of that. And if you have that sort of like, oh, it's got a Kenny G feeling vibe to it, that's all you need.
That's not what you, right, And to piggyback on what you said earlier in terms of rave being considered a flop, it was a flop in 1999. Like, this was the year of all years that Prince should have ruled from January to December. And he went through this, weird remaster 1999 single thing. And then he released this rave record with Arista and with Clive Davis and with the supernatural, Carlos Santana model that didn't really work out. And I didn't like that record. And, and then Rainbow Children came next. And I kind of felt like, is he fucking with me? Like, this is like, is he about it? Like, what's going on? So that's my take.
I have to quote Celie from the chat. And Celie says, to call smooth jazz light jazz is to say that algebra is smooth calculus. So just sit on that for a little bit. Okay, so before we transition to the celebration, and I definitely want you to talk about that, Zaheer, because you were there, and I know Harold Pryor was there. Kanisa won't let me live if we don't talk about Avalanche. Now, Avalanche isn't on the Rainbow Children, but it was performed on the One Night Alone tour, and it was on One Night Alone. I call it ... So, who wants to talk about Avalanche in context of the One Night Alone show?
Well, it was very much a twin to family name. I remember the way I think Avalanche led into family name. And, he used Abraham Lincoln and the quotes of Abraham Lincoln, and very much inspired by Lerone Bennett's Forced into Glory, the study on Abraham Lincoln. And the thesis of Lerone Bennett's work was that Abraham Lincoln was sort of dragged kicking and screaming into being the quote unquote great emancipator. And, you know, this was very much something that was shocking to a lot of people, for Prince to just come out right and say Abraham Lincoln was a racist. Right. But, you know, this was a challenging time for many people who, and I think some of this came up in the previous session, people who wanted to see Prince in a certain kind of way. And Prince was really challenging his audience with a declaration of who he was. You know, Anil talked about, you know, 9/11, but we had in 2000, you know, a disputed election that resulted for many people illegitimately in the election of George W. Bush. And then, you know, you saw a mobilizing of Black intellectuals and scholars and activists for a significant period of time. In fact, in early 2001, or maybe a month before 9/11, a lot of activists had gathered in Durban, South Africa, to begin raising the question of reparations, which, you know, Randall Robinson had raised in his book, The Debt, which Prince, you know, gestured to with his covering of When Will We Be Paid? So there is this whole period of time where Prince is, you know, taking his what was his own initial career critique of the music industry and using the metaphor of slavery, really going more literally and historically into that question, talking about reparations, talking about slavery, you know, in Family Name, the idea of the name change and the forced name change, and, you know, referencing Thomas Jefferson, who we know fathered children with a woman he owned, whether or not he understood that to be a relationship. That was a woman that he owned, Sally Hemings. And so all of that, you know, the sort of hypocrisies of that were laid bare in American history, Prince had begun talking about in the war. And in fact, you know, this notion of the digital garden and this creation of a whole ecosystem of the way that Prince mapped it out was already, the groundwork was being laid at least 2 to 3 years before the Rainbow Children is very much like the fruition of that thinking. And, you know, like, I just remember you know, I was in a listening session and people were freaking out. I'm just going to tell you, I remember reading on altmusic.prince, which was one of the older message boards, and on prince.org, people were like, how could he? I feel betrayed. I feel abandoned. At the listening sessions at Paisley Park, yes, there were people who, you know, sounded like they experienced conversion experiences, and I think he was encouraged by that, but there were also people who were freaking out, and they were like, I mean, I literally heard stuff like, why are there only Black people on the album cover? You know, what happened to the multiracial band idea? You know, why is Prince talking about race so much? Which is why the Jehovah's Witness was not the container to understand this. You know, and just the thing with Najee, and I want to pull in, you know, Erica's piece. You know, Erica did this interview with Najee, and I never knew Najee was Muslim. And
I've interviewed Najee.
For Prince to have employed Najee in the making of the Rainbow Children was really important, because there were some people who were let go from Prince's camp because they didn't go along with the studying of the Bible in the Watchtower. And so there were even people who were feeling like, if you weren't, and I mean, look, in 2000 at the Celebration, I know I'm saying a lot of stuff, but I'm just like, but it's a lot of stuff. In 2000 at the Celebration, the 2000 Celebration that he performed in Northrop Auditorium, and, you know, I remember he performed Anastasia, and he was like, if you don't believe in Jesus, I don't know what to tell you. Right. And there were a lot of people who were like, well, damn, like, I feel, you know, and this is when he would say, he would revise the lyrics to Purple Rain and say, if you know, you say you want to lead it, but you can't seem to make up your mind, I think you better close it, open up the Bible and let God guide you. I mean, it was a very sectarian presentation, but that wasn't the container that Prince was in. So let me tell you, at the Celebration, people were freaking out. Some people like were negatively responding to the patriarchy in the album. Right. Some people were negatively responding to the very very rigid gender constructions in the album. Right. People were responding to the sectarian presentation of religion, the challenging of the Trinity concept. So and Prince actually invited some people to his, conference room. I didn't go, but one of my friends went and tried to explain, what he was trying to do with the album. And sitting next to him was Larry Graham, and Prince deferred to Larry Graham on many of the questions that people had. So I think this was a period of time where Prince was in the zealous, very, the early convert zealot mode. And by the time, that this period had ended, Prince had integrated this new information. He had assimilated this new information into who he was, right? Because he talks about, reproduction of the new breed leader is a throwback to Sexuality in the Controversy album. That's mentioned in the Rainbow Children. You got, while she brings her, wet circles around the toy while you bring yourself to joy. Like, he's talking about vibrators. Like, this is not Jehovah's Witness safe material. That's a throwback to the AccuJack.
Yeah.
In the Sexuality album.
Right.
The Akashic Records, which other people have talked about before, this very, strong message on Black liberation. It was a Black liberation theology of the Jehovah's Witness doctrine that he had gotten. And, he was once asked, he was just like, are you down with all this stuff? He was like, I take what makes sense to me. And he was like, the minute you start talking about stuff that don't make sense to me, I'm out the door. Right. And that was always Prince's thing. And so, so I know you asked this question about Avalanche. So let me come back to Avalanche. Avalanche is such a beautiful song. It reminds me of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the sorrow songs. Mm-hmm. It is very much in the style of an old spiritual. And it not only talks about what happened to Black people with, slavery, but it also talks about what happened to the Native people, right? Because he talks about Wounded Knee. And Prince was calling people snowflakes before, but he's talking about people not wanting to take responsibility for the history that we have all inherited and that we can't run from it. And I just think that was such a really important message. So I loved Avalanche. I loved the performance of it. I loved the message of it. And I don't think as a historian, I understand that history is an argument that we make about the past. It is not the past. It is an argument we make about the past, an interpretation. And I very much welcomed Prince making the argument that he made.
Just want to tag on a couple quick things on that. I think the first, totally agreeing on Avalanche. I think one of the things I love, he was always ahead of his time, right? So he was 20 years ahead on challenging the white fragility with the core message of that, right? And the phrasing of it was, I said this in the chat, was as provocative as putting his ass out on MTV, was as provocative as making Sexy MF a single. Like anything he ever did that was about, he wasn't above stunts that were going to get some attention. And this was up there, and he knew what it would do, because who was going to get defensive? Who was, right? Like anybody who's attached to, I got to revere somebody because they're on a penny. At the same time, this was for me just my personal, there's a theocratic order. I was like, yo, you've said some stuff before. This is the first time I feel you are sexist. I think this is actually, I disagree with you, Prince. And before, you're challenging me. We're learning, I always felt it was like a dialogue, right? You listen to music and whatever. I was like, part of it is I was a little older, a little more grown. I was like, no, I disagree. Right. And I couldn't afford to go to Celebration, so I didn't go to Celebration. So I was like, I'm glad, because I would have gotten into it. Right. Like I would have man, I don't think this is right. And I was not, to my shame at the time, I was not fluent enough in anti-Semitic tropes to actually know why people were hurt about the references on the album. And I learned it from the mailing list. This is one of those ways where he catalyzed a conversation where fans are teaching fans. And I think that's what he wanted to do. And that I was grateful for. But people who voiced it to me, especially Jewish people, I was like, oh, that's real. That is real. Like, and I don't think his intent was to hurt something. Like, I'm not ascribing ill intent. I think one, he might not have known the tropes, or he might not have known quite what he was playing with, or sometimes he'd walk things back. I mean, we saw him do that in interviews where he had said things that were, again, frankly, to my take, homophobic, and then he'd be like, well, what I meant was, right? And I think he sort of, was learning out loud. And so I'm not judging him. I don't know enough to judge him, but I think this as a record was the first time where I was like, whoa, I am having to decide, do I go with Prince here on this? Do I feel it? Because before it had never been that. And some of that, and I think Avalanche is a catalyst to this. I wrote this actually about Janet Jackson, but I think this is true about a lot of artists. We grew up from the 60s to the 80s in the colorblind view of like post-racial, this is how we're going to deal with the sort of, critical issues of race in the country. And, I said this where like in her last album, Janet sort of said, like, she basically says that the Rhythm Nation was a dream, but not real. And now we're on to something a little more complicated and hard, basically. And I think it's this, like, look at Prince, right? So in Diamonds and Pearls, he's talking about, you will be colorblind. Like, that's the lyric, right? And it's 3 years later and he's got slave written on his face. Right. 4 years later. Right. So it's like, oh, somebody learned like colorblindness is not the way. And you know what I mean? Like, that's not going to get us there. And so that was the really striking thing for me. It was like, I loved the flag planted in the ground on Avalanche about like, this is a black man talking about black experience and you need to understand what it is. I loved the parts of Family Name that were about that. And then having them juxtaposed right against where I'm like, yeah, whoa, but you're not, I don't think you're in the right on this part. That was like, for me, that was growing as a Prince fan. Like, can I love this man enough to love a thing where I feel like he needs to grow? And I think he did on those parts too. But that was, and that it was funny because like when it was Avalanche and it was a thing I already was on board with, where I'm like, fuck these presidents, I don't care. You know what I mean? Like that doesn't mean anything to me. That was easy. And the other parts was like, oh, I see where I'm feeling the way others are. Like, wow, you're coming into something that feels like it. Me, I feel defensive. What do I need to challenge, change, or disagree?
So we're actually already over an hour. Like, it flies by. So no, that's not a diss to you at all. I just want to let everyone know where we are in terms of time, because I think it was last year or the year before last, people say I never leave time for questions from the audience. So I want to make sure I get these questions in from the audience. So there is a Q&A box. So don't put your questions in the chat because I don't have that window open. If you want a question asked, you need to put it in the Q&A box, which is two over from the chat box on the same horizontal row. So I'm going to go with Rakabash because Zaheer actually brought up Larry Graham, at the celebration, and Rakabash had asked, can you talk about the bass work Larry Graham played on the Rainbow Children and his importance to Prince? Elliott, do you want to take that? I saw you nodding your head.
Well, I was just nodding my head because I was like, that's a great question. So I mean, obviously he's Larry Graham, right? I mean, it's hard for me to be like, he's not phenomenal, right? But I think one of the things that I think is also a problem about comparing Rainbow Children to Neo Soul. One, it feels like it's a rehash of the Around the World in a Day and Sgt. Pepper's argument, right? Which is a wrong argument, it's a lazy argument, we know it's not true. I think about when we think about this moment with the Rainbow Children and we think about his work with Larry Graham, I think this is another kind of way that it's pushing back, and I think in some really important ways around Neo Soul, that it seems as if that Prince is also not only this is Prince and Larry Graham, Maceo. I'm thinking about, right, this is a harken back in part to like folks like George Clinton, but the way in which he's actually bringing his influences with him to actually help reshape his sound in a way that I think doesn't necessarily ring to be true to be sort of neo soul. It's this other kind of thing that I think the Prince is doing, and especially if we think about in comparison to Rave, right, which was seen as he's chasing trends, he's working with the contemporary artists. When he works with Larry Graham, there's a complete kind of rebuff of that, right? There's a pushback against that, and having Larry Graham help him craft this jazz funk record in some really, really important ways. It further instantiates his own blackness. This goes actually back to Zaheer's point. That I think is also really crucial about Avalanche is what does it mean for Prince to perform Avalanche, for Prince to perform Avalanche as Prince, right? This is now he's left the symbol. And so for folks who might be saying, okay, no more symbol, no more slave on the face, he's going to go back to this other thing. And then Prince hits you with Avalanche, and then Prince hits you with Family Lane. He's letting you know, I'm Prince, right? And I'm black, and I'm going to continue to be black, right? So for those folks who might have been holding out in that period during this fight with Warner Brothers and the name, they might think that this might the whole kind of slave stuff might just be a way. I'm just going to put that on hold, and I'm going to wait for Prince to get back to Prince, and so then he can get back to the colorblindness. For me, Avalanche becomes important because it further lets a particular kind of audience know what you thought was going to happen is not what actually is going to happen. And I think working with Larry Graham is very much a part of that as well, right? It's very much a part of a particular kind of instantiation and highlighting of the complexity and the pluralities of Black music.
Okay. I have a couple of factoids. I'm not going to go on long. I just wanted to say, in the Everlasting Now, verse 2, he's talking about Sly Stone. You know, he mentions everyday people. He mentions everybody's the star, like in the lyrics of it. He says, mess with the flag, and to them, you're still a spade. When he's saying mess with the flag, he's kind of making a reference to there's a riot going on, which little show and tell I happen to have. Like mess with the flag, you know, Slide sort of changed colors and changed the stars and stuff like that. So that's in there. And of course, Larry Graham was part of Sly and Family Stone. Right. As well in the work, part 1, he mentions someone said got to go through it to get to it. That's like an old Graham Central Station single from 1974 from the Release Yourself record that Graham Central Station did. You know, Larry Graham split from Sly and the Family Stone, had his own band, Graham Central Station. And so, you know, he's throwing out references to Sly and Larry Graham and sort of bigging him up as, you know, Larry Graham is also teaching him in the ways of the Jehovah's Witness faith and playing on the record. So those things bear mention.
So another question is, do you think that Prince included Wedding Feast on the album because he married Manuela that year?
Well, you know, I think, and Matt mentioned this a little bit in his presentation, the Rainbow Children is doing multiple duty here, right? Like it's talking about Prince's conversion, you know, it's reflecting his conversion experience. It's also, you know, talking about the dissolution of his marriage to Maite and his courtship and eventual marriage with Manuela. In much the way that 3121 talks about the dissolution of his marriage to Manuela. You know, you know, like Prince, you know, he lived his experiences and they influenced his frame of reference. And so, yeah, this was, you know, the Rainbow Children and Musicology were the Manuela era records. They reflected his relationships with her. I mean, well, actually, we, you know, and just very much the way like New Power Soul, Emancipation and New Power Soul were the Maite records, right? That reflected the relationships and the challenges that were in those relationships. And, you know, so I think that, yeah, I do think that the Rainbow Children was very much a Manuela story. And, you know, my understanding of the history is that Manuela actually started studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses before Prince did. And that, you know, this was very much something that was really important and was important to him. It was an important signal to him in terms of, you know, someone that he felt, you know, kinship with. And so, yeah, I do think that was reflected. I mean, I think that relationship, you know, I remember going to the celebration in 2000. We just being real here and candid. That hallway that you would walk down and now has all the murals painted on it. The final image you would see, this is before the murals, the final image you would have seen was a gold era image of Prince with his arms around Maite, right? That was in 2000. When we went back in 2001, that was gone. right? Like, this was very much a time that Prince was experiencing significant change. I think Anil referenced this in his comment. The Kingdom Hall provided stability to Prince, and provided him an anchor. And look, when we went to Paisley Park for the celebration, I think in 2001, especially in 2000, it was kind of, still getting it together. In 2001, Prince was walking around in the soundstage, that's actually the first time I met him. He was just like walking around and he would talk to people. He was very comfortable, right? And that's, that was reflected in Anil talked about the sound checks and like his welcoming us into his space. There was something about his spiritual life that brought him a kind of peace that I don't think we had seen. In his personal, like, he wasn't paranoid about people. He was just like chilling, and people took advantage of it. People started stealing shit out of the kitchen, and they had to be like, no one goes into, like, they just kept us in the soundstage, and that just tells you how, like, people overstep their bounds. But even with all of that, Prince was deeply, like, grounded, and I don't even say grounded, but elevated, and he was very comfortable. And I think, Manuela brought that into his life. Manuela, who had been a fan, was a window into what kinds of experiences fans were interested in. He said he added the joy and repetition to his set list because it was her favorite song. And I know that people have a lot of opinions about the women who were in Prince's lives, but I do think in this moment it was important. And look, Larry Graham, I'm gonna be very honest with you all. I was not a fan of what I thought Larry Graham was doing to Prince.
Me either.
And I do, Anil, when you heard the theocratic order, there was a sectarianism in the way that Prince was articulating his spirituality that was 100%. Very closed in the way that it wasn't with Love Sexy, in the way that it wasn't with Controversy, which was like very open. And part of this was age. Part of this was coming to terms with mortality, with the passing of his father and the illness of his mother. Part of this was, the challenges he had experienced in his life. So he was like, I remember some of the posts that he would authorize on the NPG Music Club news board, that was just downright mean. At one point, after his wife suffered a miscarriage, he posted something about like wearing makeup causes birth defects, but you still wear it, don't you? It was really nasty. And I think we have to come to terms with all of the complexities of who Prince was. And he, of course, was a person in motion. And so I'm not trying to freeze him in that time. But in that moment, it was sometimes really challenging. I was Muslim, and I am Muslim, and I listened to Prince as a Muslim from the very beginning. So I was never looking to Prince for like doctrinal instruction, but I do think there were people who were, and they were hurt. They felt abandoned, and I don't make light of that at all. There were people who were deeply Christian who did not understand the Jehovah's Witness turn, because Jehovah's Witnesses, as much as obviously they are Christian, they have like very clear like readings of and interpretations of the Bible that would like mark other people as not Christian, right? And their tradition of missionary work is very much rooted in dialectic conversation, which is debate oriented. And I think Prince thrived on that, right? But I think, the celebration, I think what he saw with people responding, I think it caused him, and I think as Anil talked about, was sometimes he would say something and he would walk back. I remember, I don't know if it was an interview, but he was talking about why he talked about Rosenblum and Ghost Truck. I think he took those names literally. He thought those were beautiful names, and they talked about value, to talk about a rose in bloom. Mm-hmm. And what do we get stuck with? We get stuck with being named after a slave owner. And I think that that's where he was coming from. I don't know that he felt that he was playing into tropes, but he was, of course, within a context, and there are these broader contexts of the challenges between Black and white people in the United States, between Black and Jewish people who become white in the United States. And so sometimes the experience that Black people have with white Jewish people are the experiences that they have with white people, not the experiences they have with Jewish people. So James Baldwin wrote this, essay, Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white. And it wasn't saying that Negroes are anti-Semitic, and it wasn't saying that Negroes are anti-white. It was saying that Jewish people, in becoming white in the United States, had become participants in white privilege in ways that Italians had, in the ways that Irish had, in the ways that other ethnic whites had in the United States, and that in their interaction with Black people were sometimes not that different. And so I think that that's where some of that was coming from. And it's fraught, there is a long-standing tradition of Black Jewish cooperation in the civil rights movement and in moving forward the rights and advantages of Black people. But there are also long-standing ways that the Jewish people had access to opportunities that Black people did not have access to. And so there were friction-generating contacts between tenant and landlord, between customer and shopkeeper, between talent and management. And this is very real. And I think that, Prince as an artist, he was very sensitive. That she got the chimes going on.
Oh, that's not me.
Okay. I thought she was like, I don't wrap it up.
Thank you so much for it, because we do need to kind of wrap it up.
I wanted to put some of that context that I think informed some of what Prince was doing. And I don't think, look, even the comments that he's often attributed of making about, supposedly he said to Wendy and Lisa, you can come back, but you gotta accept the Bible and you gotta reject homosexuality. Like, whether or not he said that, I think once that got out there, he made it very clear that that was not his spirit. And proof of that is he asked Wendy to perform with him Reflection on the Tabitha Smiley Show. He asked Wendy and Lisa to perform with him in 2006 at the Brit Awards. And according to Ruth, his manager, Prince envisioned an all-woman band that included Wendy, that included Lisa, that included Sheila, right? Before Third Eye Blind. I'd say Third Eye Blind. Before Third Eye Girl, right? And so, I think that, Prince, the Rainbow Children is such a really important snapshot, and it's just important that we understand Prince was always in motion.
So thank you so much for that. And I actually have to end a little early because of a miscommunication. We are going to schedule a talk in between the scheduled break, and I want to make sure that Aisha gets to give her talk. So at 4:30, we're actually going to switch over to her talk, and it's 7 ways Prince celebrates Black history, culture, and political ideology in the Rainbow Children. There are actually a lot of amazing questions in the Q&A. We always run out of time in this conversation. We always go, we will have enough to talk about, but then we always could talk forever. So I would just like to thank each and every one of you for being here again. This made my day. I always look forward to this. So thank you so much, each and every one of you. And I hope that some of you will join me over for the next talk. And if Erica is still here, if you don't mind, I'm going to see if I can pull you, ask you a question about something. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the Core 4, as I'm calling you guys.
Thank you so much for having us, D'Angela. D'Angela, is there a way to save the chat? Because I know that Anil was adding stuff. I want to go back.
I want to read all of that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know that Hopin saved all the chats. I don't know yet if AirMeet saves all the chats.
When you log us out, does this chat disappear? Like, we can't scroll back?
I don't think you can come back. I think this is it.
Okay. Well, thank you all.
Somebody do some copying and pasting.
Yeah, copy and pasting.
Yeah,
Copy
this
paste.
looked amazing.
That was fresh.
I saw the twin, Camila and Cambria just going in. I saw Anil, I saw Nicolay, but I couldn't catch all of the comments. So thank you, everyone.
Easy.
Becky, thank you, everyone who commented. And I wish I could go back and catch all of it, but we might miss you all.
Yeah, let me just say, Prince brings us together. We're all fans of him, appreciate him. But you all on this group, man, I'm fans of all of you. Like, Zaheer, that was an entire education you delivered.
Right.
I can't even say enough good things. Like, I'm so appreciative. Like, I could sit and listen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all. I love this crew. I look forward to next year. We're already arguing on what the album is going to be. But D'Angela, whenever you call, we're here. So
we're here.
100%.
Yeah.
Yay. Awesome. So thank you so much again. And we are going to move to the next session with the